Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Winiflor from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Thank you for joining today's webinar on evaluating advocacy. This webinar is part of our 2013 monthly nonprofit advocacy webinar series. Before we get started, I'd like to talk about a couple of things. First, you should see a slide on your computer screen with the title of today's webinar. If you don't, or if you have any problems during the webinar, please dial Start Meeting's toll-free support line directly for assistance. The number is 800-644-9070. Again, that number is 800-644-9070. That number is also listed in the instructional email that was sent to you yesterday. In order to ensure good sound quality and eliminate background noise, we have muted the phone lines. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. But we do want you to ask questions. The way to do that is by using the chat box on the right side of your screen. You can choose to have your question seen by just the presenter or by all participants by selecting which recipient gets the message. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box at any point during the webinar. We'll also set aside some time at the end for questions. After today, we'll send a follow-up email with a link to watch the webinar recording on our YouTube channel. Next month, our topic will be building strategic relationships with elected officials. Please register online on our website if you'd like to join the session. Now, let me turn things over to MCN's Public Policy Director, Susie Brown.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for this advocacy webinar on advocacy evaluation. My name is Susie Brown. I'm the Director of Public Policy here at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Before we get started, I'd like to just share with you what we do here in public policy at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. We support individual nonprofits and Minnesota's nonprofit sector to be their own voice in the public policy process. And we provide training on advocacy and lobbying and serve as a resource to policymakers on the nonprofit sector and advocate on issues that impact all nonprofits, such as incentives to charitable giving, nonprofit tax exemptions, lobbying rights, and election activity rights. In fact, yesterday, our Board of Directors just approved our 2014 legislative agenda, which outlines the various policy positions that we'll be working on in the next year, so we'll make that available to all of you in the next few weeks, and we look forward to working both with you and on your behalf. As Mark mentioned, this is the 11th in our series, our 2013 Nonprofit Advocacy Webinar Series. Should you be interested, we hope you join us in a little bit less than a month for another session on developing strategic relationships with elected officials, December 11th. And also, I'd just like to call your attention to a meeting that we have every year on the first Friday of the legislative session called Session Lineup. That occurs at the Kelly Inn in St. Paul, and we invite members from the legislative caucuses, the House and Senate leaders from both the Republican and the Democratic parties, as well as the governor's office. And we have a robust session kickoff conversation with several hundred of our closest nonprofit friends. We hope you join us. The first Friday of the legislative session this year is Friday, February 28th. You can expect to see more about that coming in the coming weeks. I will be presenting today with my friend and colleague Rachel Calnan. Rachel has had several advocacy roles in the nonprofit sector in Minnesota, and she's currently the Regional Vice President of Advocacy for the American Heart Association. Also, as a side note, Rachel has a significant expertise in the area of evaluating advocacy, as it was the topic of her master's thesis and her master's in nonprofit management. So she's a great resource, and we're delighted to have her here with us today. Advocacy evaluation is a topic that we thought was important to talk about in this webinar series for a couple of reasons. One is that evaluation, as we all know in the nonprofit sector, can be challenging in general for a lot of different reasons. And in advocacy, there can be some particular challenges. Often the outcomes, the big systems change outcomes, feel out of our control. Often the political and economic context in which we work is out of our control. Sometimes it's not clear exactly how our contribution impacted the difference that's being made, but it is very important and useful for us to think about how to do the best, most strategic advocacy evaluation for our work, both to think about how we're building our own internal capacity and how we are affecting the external environment. So as with our other advocacy webinars, we like to start with sharing our learning objectives with you. The content of today's webinar is designed around achieving these learning objectives. If you don't get what you need in these areas, we really hope to be a resource to you. So as we're going, keep your thoughts on achieving these objectives and ask questions as we go, if you care to, using the chat function, or please don't hesitate to contact either one of us after this webinar if you'd like clarification on any of these points. So what we hope you learn today are the following. We'll consider the purpose and uses of advocacy evaluation. We'll learn about unique challenges to evaluating advocacy. We'll understand how to get ready for advocacy evaluation, how to prepare for it within your organization or program. And we'll discover specific techniques and tools for evaluating advocacy. First, just a quick overview of the purpose and uses of advocacy evaluation. The purpose is to understand program effectiveness and adjust efforts as needed. We hope that you come away from this webinar with a deeper understanding of how this process, doing advocacy evaluation, will help you be effective and will help you see that there are ways that you can evaluate along the way in your advocacy work in order to adjust and become more effective throughout the course of your work. And there are some very specific uses for advocacy evaluation: program planning, stakeholder accountability, and funder reports are all things that we'll talk about today. So we'll dig into each of these a bit more. I'm now going to turn it over to Rachel, who will start with the purpose.
Great, thanks, Susie, and thanks for inviting me to co-present today. So I'm going to a little deeper dive on the purpose for advocacy evaluation. First, evaluation really is important to be able to tell a coherent story about your organization or your program's effectiveness. The goals really are the same for any kind of program evaluation you might be doing, but the methods are probably going to be different because advocacy is, and we'll talk a little more about, there are some specific challenges or unique challenges to advocacy. But you're working essentially to demonstrate your program's effectiveness to some audience. It might be your funder, it might be your board of directors, it might be your own stakeholders, or as we're going to talk a little more about too, it may be an internal audience so that you just are internally understanding how effective you are working in this area. A second purpose is that internal learning. What tactics worked better in a policy campaign than others? And it really can help you to plan your advocacy work for future years. And we know that as we go along, we're making adjustments on the fly all the time, but it's really nice to have a plan for evaluation so that it really fits in that bigger long-term vision of your policy work. So moving on to the next element is what are some of the more specific uses for your evaluation? Well, you might have, as we already talked about, program planning. You need to be internally monitoring your progress towards your goals for some reason or another, again, whether it's for funders or just your internal learning. A second use might be you're measuring staff performance. And I can give an example from my own organization. We have very specific metrics that we measure around our grassroots efforts. How many people took action, how many people came to the Capitol and met with lawmakers, things like that. And we use that in our performance evaluation at the year end. So that's another internal use. You may also just use that information for internal learning purposes so that you can adjust your strategies or tactics. If it's really clear that, for example, email action alerts are not working with the legislators you're trying to target or influence, you may need to shift your tactics. And tracking this kind of information can be helpful in doing that. Another is reporting to both your outcomes and your progress. So we're going to talk a little more later on about in advocacy, the ultimate outcome often is to pass whatever bill it is, or on the defensive side, kill whatever bill it is that you're working for or against. But there are interim little progress markers throughout your campaign that you can be tracking so that you know how effective you're being. And so we're going to talk a little more in depth about what those might look like. But you may want to be able to report some of those outcomes to your constituency, your stakeholders, so that they know where you're at in your effort. And then you also may want to, you're most likely going to want to present some of that information to your own funders, whether that be individual donors or a foundation may have very specific information they want to get from you as part of the evaluation. And then finally, you also may want to gather this information so that you can share it with other organizations. If you have a real cutting-edge issue that you're working on, or it's the first time, let's say, in the nation that anyone has taken on this kind of a campaign before, you may want to share that information with your colleagues in the state or even in other states to help them with their efforts, policy efforts in other states. So now I'm going to dive into some of the unique challenges of advocacy evaluation. So hopefully at this point you have a general sense of why you might want to do the evaluation. Now we're shifting focus into, what might you face as you're really thinking about it. So one of the challenges really is advocacy is rarely a clear, linear process. There's often complexity, shifting political sands, shifting economic environment that are going to influence your ability or some of the tactics that you might use to advance your policy. So you might have other programs in your organization that feel much more clear. It's very linear about how you're going to evaluate these programs. Advocacy is going to be a little different. So, some of the external factors are going to be constantly changing. So you need to be nimble to be able to address those challenges. And so I urge you to consider this nimbleness as a strength and not to consider it as a deficit. That, really it's a strong organization that can respond to these sort of random changes in the environment and come out strong with a plan. And so that, I think will be your goal. So another really important thing to think about is time frames for policy change. They can be very long. They can be many, many years. I know my organization and many other organizations worked for literally decades on passing a smoke-free law in Minnesota, Freedom to Breathe, passed in 2007. And it really took decades to build the momentum to get to that point of passing that law. So knowing that some of our policies are going to take many years to pass, what can we do to measure our progress towards advancing that policy? So that's where short-term benchmarks can come in, and you can really measure each year, set your interim goals, and measure your progress to your ultimate goal of passing a bill. So another challenge is you may have differing expectations between advocates and funders. And you may have multiple funders, and they have different expectations about what they want evaluated. So that can create some challenges, and I think, as nonprofits that are active in working in public policy, I think it is one of our roles to really help inform funders and educate them about what it takes to pass a bill, and to really help them understand that perhaps their funding timeline doesn't fit perfectly with the legislative session timeline, and to really have a dialogue with them about that. And then the other challenge is as we often see, you may have a great plan for advancing an ambitious public policy agenda, and then all of a sudden the session gets underway and you are playing defense on an issue. And so you need, again, back to the nimbleness, you may need to shift your focus and reprioritize as a result. And then finally, partnerships are essential. Very few efforts move forward at the Capitol without some kind of partnership. And so it's important to be tracking your contributions to an effort so that you can really balance that ability to attribute where you've been responsible for moving the needle or you've contributed to that.
And I'll just jump in here for a second. For those of you who joined us last month for the fundraising for advocacy, we talked a fair amount about this question of partnerships and balancing contribution and attribution. And, I think when we're evaluating advocacy, we can all imagine that if 10 years later, all of the coalition partners say, yay, we finally won and we did it, then that's both insufficient evaluation over time and probably inaccurate evaluation at the end point, because in fact many voices and many efforts and many years often went into getting an ultimate win. So while it's really important to celebrate the ultimate win, thinking about how organizations can break it down both over the timeline but also to identify their own unique contribution and figure out how that fits in with the contributions of others is both a challenge and an opportunity for us in advocacy evaluation.
Great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about getting ready. And before I launch into this slide, I just want to give a caveat that, our goal here today is really to set you up to set you in the direction of exploring advocacy evaluation and how you might begin to do it or improve your practices if you're already doing it. So we're not going to necessarily walk you through every step of the process, but really our goal is to introduce the topic and give you some good tools as you are working on it in the future. So for getting ready, we've already talked about know your purposes. You really need to understand why you want to do this advocacy evaluation. It really could be that internal drive to understand how to improve your own practices and that internal learning. It may also be you have requirements by funders, or it may be both. It may be multiple reasons, purposes that you're doing it. And then secondly, and very much related, who's your audience and what do they want to know? So really, looking at what do you want to measure, not just because it's easy to measure or because it's out there, but really what does your audience need to know to understand whether you're being effective or not? And then what are some of the methods and tools for evaluation that serve your purposes and are doable? So if you come up with a really ambitious plan to do a very elaborate evaluation, but you don't have the resources or the time to do it, it's just not doable. So, set realistic expectations, and I would urge, try to keep it as simple as you possibly can so that you actually are going to follow through on some of these goals. And we're going to, at the last couple slides, we're going to point you to some really great tools and resources that can help you walk through the process. And then fourth, in your organization, identify who is going to be responsible for tracking for your evaluation, and it may be a combination of people. So if you are tracking, what kind of media coverage did we get on our issue, that might be your communication staff person that's going to keep track of that. If it's what's our policy progress at the Capitol, how did our bill advance, what were the authors, that sort of thing. That's probably going to be your policy person or your lobbyist who would be tracking some of that information. It's really, that will be your internal discussion, but it's important to clarify those roles so you know who's going to be tracking that information. And then number 5, know your theory of change. Some people also call it a logic model, but it's really, just to help you understand how your part of the world and influencing your part of the world. Susie's going to talk a little more in depth about logic models, but basically these are some of the things you'll need to be checking off your list, because that's what you're going to need to know to identify what methods and how you're going to implement your evaluation.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about logic models, or also known as theory of change. And the actual titles of these things are less important than the concept. But an important starting place for your organization is really to think about how your work is going to change the world. So how is it that the actual activities that your organization will undertake will have an impact on the systems or policies that you desire to be changed? Creating a model for this, or a picture, or a theory, helps us link our desired outcomes together in a logical way. So it shows a roadmap, essentially, for how we're going to get where we want to go. And it helps us see the steps in the roadmap in a way that allows us to adjust along the way if we need to. So a first step is orienting your organization by constructing a logic model for your advocacy efforts. On the next slide, I'll show you a picture of one. If you've looked ahead, you've already seen it, and I'm sure you recognize it. But basically, write it out. Say A leads to B, A plus B equals C, or X plus Y equals Z. How are we going to get where we want to go? This helps your organization fit your campaign strategy, tactics, and evaluation into a whole picture, into the theory of change. And it's a process to help you clarify what you plan to achieve and how you're going to get there, essentially a roadmap. So if we were all together in a room, I'd say raise your hand who's made chocolate chip cookies before. I bet most of us have, or we've seen somebody who looks like that lady do it. We wanted to use this chocolate chip cookie example because it's very clear, a little corny, but very concrete. So in a logic model, we have these 4 steps: inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. And it's like a recipe. Essentially, the inputs are the resources of our organization. What do we have to work with? This could be a variety of things. It could be relationships with legislators. It could be grassroots supporters. It could be knowledge. It could be research. It could be history and credibility. It could be a whole bunch of different things. In this case, we've got butter, eggs, chips, flour, all that. What are the things that we have to use, the tools at our disposal? The second question is, what will we do with those resources? This nice woman is mixing them up to make cookies. What are we going to do to deploy our resources in a way that makes sense given the outcome that we're interested in the world? The outputs are what occurs because of our putting our resources to work. So using this very concrete example, we have these items, we mix them together, we put them in the oven, and we get a cookie. So what is it that we actually want to see happen in a concrete way? Is it a bill passing? Is it, well, often it might be a bill passing. What is the particular policy outcome that we're looking for? Output that we're looking for. And then the outcome is really the impact. So what's different in the world because of it? So I'll use a policy example to go along with the cookies. One of the inputs that your organization might have would be people who care about something. If you're an affordable housing organization, you may have people who are united in their mutual caring about affordable housing. That's a resource. That's an input. So the question is, what do you do with that resource? What do you do with that input? Put it together into an activity. Well, one thing you could do is have everybody call their legislators to support a bill. Maybe it's a bonding bill for more affordable housing. So the activity is you do grassroots outreach, you ask them to do a very specific thing, and they do it. The output is they make the calls and the legislators vote for the bill and the bill passes. And the outcome then is that there's increased resources for affordable housing in Minnesota. And back to the inputs, the people who care about your organization, care about the work that you're doing, care about this issue, are able to realize what they are hoping for in the world, which is increased resources for affordable housing. So sometimes when we see, for example, funding requests or reports, we see words like this that are maybe slightly different, slightly nuanced, put in a different order. These things can become confusing, outputs, outcomes. I suggest, if it works for you as it does for me, to think back to the cookie recipe and keep it simple and think, what are the resources that we have? What do we intend to do with those resources? What will occur because of what we've done with the resources? And what is the ultimate impact in society? If you can think about it in that way, you can create a logic model or a theory of change which will help guide your work and will help you adjust it along the way. I'll turn it over to Rachel now, who's going to talk more specifically about some examples of using a logic model.
Great. So I think, I didn't realize there was
We're just going to watch these arrows go for a minute. There we go.
All right. So this next slide digs a little deeper on logic model specifically for an advocacy effort. And so a lot of the same terminology that Susie just noted is also here, but there are a couple differences, so I'm just going to point those out. So in the first little box, the first column there under inputs, Susie mentioned that might be your capacity building internally in your organization for a policy effort. So that may be, making sure you have the staff in place to advance a policy. It may be, working within a coalition, that sort of thing. It may be some policy research that you need to do to identify what the policy you might be looking at should be. The next column is activities and tactics. And, Susie already kind of covered those, so I'm going to move on to where the outputs will be that interim outcomes and the policy goals columns. So outputs are going to be things like we had 40 people show up at our day at the Capitol and met with legislators. Outputs might be we finally secured a hearing on our bill in the House committee. Those might be some of the outputs that you would look at under those interim outcomes and policy goals. And I can give some more examples about those. And then the final is your outcome. So what is the impact? So say you did pass your bill, what do you hope to be the impact of that? You hope to, back to Susie's example of affordable housing, you hope to create more units of affordable housing so that more people in Minnesota are housed. So that might be your ultimate outcome that you want to see happen. And then at the bottom, you'll see there are additional factors that kind of create some complexity. So there are contextual factors that are really going to influence every step of the way in this logic model. And some of those contextual factors we've already touched on. It might be the political atmosphere, it could be the economic climate, but it also might be what are some of the competing interests at the Capitol this year. If there are some really big picture issues that are drawing the attention of the legislature, you may have a tough time just getting the legislature's attention and having the bandwidth to get your issue in play. So those are some of the contextual factors that might influence those things. And then, of course, there are the audiences. So, audiences can be the legislature, it can be the media, and so throughout this process, you want to be considering those audiences as part of your logic model. And so I wanted to give just a couple of examples, I think, quickly on, so a policy campaign that the Heart Association worked on a couple years ago was a physical education bill. And our ultimate impact that we were hoping to have is to improve the health of kids in Minnesota. And so one of our policy goals, then sort of working backwards, was to pass a physical education bill that really strengthened quality physical education in Minnesota. And some of the sort of steps towards that policy the interim outcomes that we sought to achieve were to get hearings for our bill, to get a large number of bipartisan authors signed on to our bill. And so those are some of the interim outcomes that we were able to measure through our process. We also were able to measure some of the grassroots capacity that we had built to support the issue. So we were able to measure how many people took action and our email action alerts, how many people came to the Capitol and met with X number of legislators for our day at the Capitol. Those kinds of measures were some of our interim outcomes that we were tracking to make sure that we were on track for success. And then, moving backwards, our activities and tactics. We formed a coalition. We, built internal capacity, hired a contract lobbyist to help us pass the bill. We made sure that we had, within our coalition, that we had the stakeholders at the table that really needed to be there. So all of those things were accomplished as part of our logic model to pass that bill, which I'm happy to say did pass. So next in our learning objectives today, we wanted to talk through some of the methods for advocacy evaluation. We did talk about that this type of evaluation can be a little bit different than you might use for other programs in your organization. And so we just wanted to talk through some of the methods that you might be using and really dividing them into two different columns. There's really looking at methods of advocacy evaluation for your internal capacity for doing advocacy, and then there's more of the external policy progress, looking at broad public support or media interest in the issue. So we're just going to walk through some of those methods. Who can go to the next slide? And I'm going to talk.
Well, I was just going to say, before we get started on this, I just want to highlight that it's very important to think about both internal capacity and policy progress. And if nothing else today, we hope that nobody on this call leaves and thinks that the only way to evaluate your advocacy is to determine whether the bill ultimately passed or didn't. That is a very important moment in our work, that it is so important and essential to think about what gets us there, not only in the policy process externally, but also what gets us there internally, because really an essential part of what we can and should be doing is thinking about how we can get stronger and more sophisticated at this work along the way. So Rachel will talk about internal first.
All right, great. So for internal capacity, one of the things you might want to do is get stakeholder feedback. And this is something you could do before your campaign, during your campaign, and then after your campaign. So you can gauge, how stakeholders, your members, your clients, your coalition partners are feeling about the campaign and feel like, whether it's on track, not on track, where some improvements could be made. And stakeholder stakeholder feedback can be done in several ways. You can do, SurveyMonkey surveys, online surveys to gather that information. You can do one-on-one interviews, and that sounds very formal, but it may just be a conversation to gauge, where your members, clients, stakeholders are. You could have focus groups, either more formal kinds of focus groups or more informal kinds of focus groups. And then another method is these things called intense period debriefs. And this is a very intimidating sort of sounding process, but it's actually just a really great process to, once you've gone through a really intense period of your campaign, you may want to gather the key players in a room and do a debrief to see what worked, what didn't work, how can we improve moving forward. And there's a really great tool from Innovation Network. They've created a protocol to help guide you through doing an intense period debrief. I personally have not done one of these, so I can't speak to it directly, but I think it looks like a really good way of really getting that information in real time about how your coalition operated or your group operated in this intense period during the legislative session or whenever it may be.
If I could just jump in there with an example of, often at the end of an intense advocacy project or when a bill passes or fails or at the end of a legislative session, when we work together either internally in our organizations or with external partners, it's very common for us to say, whew, we got through that, let's all go out to lunch and, talk about what happened, or let's go have beers and say we're glad it's over or whatever. And so the spirit of a quick get-together after something intense is often there already, and taking that energy to get together and, blow off a little steam and turn it into something that's very deliberate and say, yes, maybe we can get together and have a couple of beers after this, but before we do that, let's ask ourselves these 4 questions that actually we're going to be disciplined around discussing, and they're going to help us as we go into the next session or something. So I think we often have the right kind of energy to do something like this, and it's turning it into a deliberate, intensive, and useful conversation that is our opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case. And, the goal is to attempt to document some of this because, as months and months go by, the next crisis crops up and you're moving on. And so you maybe haven't taken the time to really think through and document that tactic actually worked really well. We need to do more of that in the future. Or that tactic really fell flat. Let's devote fewer resources to that in the future. And, really is, I think, a good process. And I think we all probably informally do that. As Susie mentioned, you walk in the hallways of the Capitol and, oh, can you believe that happened? But it is, I think, good to be intentional as part of your evaluation process and to build that into your process. And then the other internal capacity I would urge you to look at measuring is your coalition support. And that is both, number of members of your coalition, but also what is their level of engagement. You can have a lot of organizations signed on to a coalition effort, but are they really engaged? And so you may be wanting to look at measures of how to engage those coalition members in a better way. And the next slide on internal capacity. With grassroots, very few bills pass at the Capitol without some grassroots support. And I think, nonprofit organizations are masters of, using our grassroots to advance an issue. So hopefully a lot of people are already tracking your grassroots traction. I know a lot of the online action alert software that people use these days have that built in, so you can know exactly how many people took action on your alert, and even how many and which legislators. You can find out which legislators were actually contacted through emails. So that's, I think, one good way of tracking your grassroots impact. There's also what we call internally at the Heart Association offline actions, and those are other types of actions like meeting and in districts with legislators, going to the Capitol and having meetings with legislators, whether that's a day at the Capitol or just, having advocates come in and meet one-on-one with legislators. It could also be letters to the editor that highlight your issue and urge the legislature to take action on that issue. Those are all things that your grassroots, any of your grassroots tactics that you're using like that, or phone calls to legislators or staff. All of those things could count, and you should be counting as part of your grassroots impact. And then next is social media, and I put the new frontier. I should have put quotes in new because social media really is not new. But I think for a lot of us, we are just starting to wade into figuring out how we're going to influence lawmakers through social media and what are some of the tactics that we can use to do that. my organization, we have, Facebook presence, Twitter presence, but we haven't taken that next step and really kind of jumped into using that to influence legislators. I know some of my colleagues in Wisconsin did recently use a Facebook tactic with a lawmaker. They were trying to pass a bill around newborn screenings for heart defects. And there's a legislator over in Wisconsin who is something of a barrier to getting the bill passed. And so they asked families with children that have heart defects to post on her Facebook page and to tag her in their own posts about their stories, urging her to hold a hearing on this issue. And I think it got some very good traction. Certainly the families were very excited about engaging in that tactic. Unfortunately, the lawmaker was not moved and actually got a little upset that she was targeted in that way. So I think, we're in a learning process in some ways about how to use social media with legislators. But if you are trying some things out, I would definitely track those outcomes, how many people did post, how many people liked it, how many people commented. Those kinds of things would be really helpful for you to gauge the effectiveness of that tactic in the future.
I'd like to just comment, Rachel, that that's such a great example of why having different things that we're measuring concurrently is really helpful, because if the only thing you were measuring was whether there was a successful hearing, then your evaluation would have shown a failure. But concurrently measuring the activity level of your grassroots support shows clear success, because engaging this number of people in this particular way, even though it didn't lead to that outcome, is something that builds the internal capacity so that you can engage them again. They feel like they're already experienced. Maybe the next time that they're brought in on something that feels meaningful to them, they'll have better success with the outcome. But building their ability to be grassroots activists is such an important thing to measure. So thank you for that example.
Yeah, and some other just quick measures of internal capacity. Do you have the policy briefs, information, research background that you need? Do you have staff and board buy-in for this issue? So gauging that level of support. Do you have funding support? Do you have funding dedicated to this effort? And do you have staff dedicated to the effort? Is your communications person bought in that they're going to help you with media advocacy as the campaign moves forward? Those are all internal measures of your own capacity. And you'll see when you get to looking at some of these tools that we'll recommend that you take a look at, all of these things are part of their template in trying to set up your own advocacy evaluation.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about methods that were on the right side of the previous slide that identified the difference between internal measures and basically external measures, or measures of our policy progress. On the next three slides, we'll talk about measuring progress in the media and the actual policy, the policymaker support and public support. I'd like to just invite you at this point to think about what questions you might have as we get toward the end of this webinar, because we'd be happy to answer them. So please think about sending some in if you have them. So as Rachel mentioned, measuring our internal capacity and our internal progress is really important. And of course, measuring how the policy is progressing is just as important to do concurrently. So a couple of ways to do that. One is to track how this issue is playing out in the media. An interesting thing to note about media tracking is that a lot of media around the issue that you're worried about may happen whether you're having any influence on that or not. And so tracking the media that happens without your influence is important, so you're understanding the external context in which you're working. But when we're thinking about evaluating our work, evaluating the media or doing tracking of the media where you've actually made a difference, where you've contributed to that, is really probably what your stakeholders and funders will want to know about, and what will be most helpful to you in your own planning for the future. We think about media in a couple of ways. Earned and paid are often the way we think about what gets placed for folks to see if they read the newspaper, for example, or watch TV. Earned media is where stories are written about our issue, or letters to the editor or opinion pieces are placed around our issue. There are many ways that we can get earned media. We could have press releases, we could have press events, we could share stories, we can ask our grassroots members to write letters to the editor, we can work with editorial boards and try to influence their views and ask them to write something. When we take these kinds of steps, we can see how the media is changing, how the view of this issue is changing in the media, and count that as part of our success. Paid media is just as it sounds. You buy an ad, you take out a half-page ad that says something like, we think there should be more affordable housing in Minnesota because people shouldn't be sleeping on the streets in the winter, something like that. You're paying for that to happen. You can see it when it happens, and you can count it as something that you've done, essentially as an input, and then we need to look at other things in order to figure out what the impact of that was. Another important thing to think about with media tracking is framing. So essentially, what are the messages that you use? How do you frame a particular issue? And is the media picking up on that? Sometimes there are two very clear sides to an issue, or very specifically different ways that issues might be discussed. One example that I worked on some years ago was we were working on the DREAM Act, and some people referred to the young folks who were interested in going to college as illegal immigrants, and we were more interested in the media referring to them as people who are undocumented. And there was a fair amount of work with the media to try to change the terms that they were using in order to frame the issue in a way that helped us with our progress. So watching the media to see if your frame is being used is a great thing to track. Okay, we also need to track the policy itself. It's not the best evaluation to just say we won or we lost at the end of the session, although if you won, you should celebrate that and have a party. But we really need to think about these things that add up to that. So a few things that you can track would be who your authors are, one of the most important things, and a great area of leverage as we're working on proactive legislation is to be strategic about your authors. Do we have bipartisan support? Do we have geographic distribution? Did we get the number of authors that we're interested in? All of these things can be set out as benchmarks and measured along the way as a way to document your success. And also just the actual progress of the bill and the old how a bill becomes a law process. Has it been introduced? Was it referred to the committee that you think is most strategic? Have there been hearings held? Have there been amendments? Things like that. Okay, also we want to assess legislator and policymaker support. There are all kinds of things we can do to get the bill to move in the right way. Eventually it goes to the floor. It also goes to committees on the way, and we need to be keeping track of how we are influencing and building support along the way. We can do that by creating a tracker, by providing ratings that say, you know, this person is soft on this issue, they get a number 1. This person is strong on this issue, they get a number 4, and show how those numbers change as we continue to work with legislators. We need to also be assessing and keeping track of the key agency leaders and the governor's office. In the end of the day, when a bill becomes a law, we really need, in almost all cases, the governor's office to be on our side. Doing that work in advance, assessing where they are, tracking their progress as you're influencing them or their staff around them is very useful. And keeping this kind of tally updated to show how your support is evolving is a great way to come to the end of the process and feel confident that you've made the steps you need to make and that your bill will be able to pass as you had planned. After the vote, it's helpful to get a final vote tally from the committee or from the floor, and sometimes it's hard to see in particular kinds of bills, if it's an omnibus bill, for example, how people voted specifically, but it's really helpful if we can see how folks voted specifically on our issue, whether it's a standalone bill or part of an omnibus bill or an amendment, to be able to compare that to the tracking mechanism that we used before, to see where we were consistent, to see where they were gaps. And then finally, we want to measure public support and public awareness. Sometimes we're fortunate enough that there's been polling on our issue, or maybe even better yet, that you have the substantial resources that it might take to conduct a poll yourself. Sometimes we're able to join in somebody else's poll and get a question asked. But it's often very important to know what the public is thinking about your issue and find a way to track that as support changes in your direction along the way. Other things that we might look at is, can we conduct surveys, interviews, or focus groups with your constituency? You can do these in very sophisticated, fancy ways where you hire firms that do this kind of evaluation for you, or you can think of more grassroots ways that you can do that through the reach that your organization has or your organization's partners. And speaking of partners, how do we use our community partnerships to increase public support among new constituencies and build our list beyond our core supporters? It's often imperative that we build support for our issues outside of who we might think of as the usual suspects, the people who are most immediately inclined to support your issue. Finding other folks that support that as well is very important. And then sometimes it's important that we do interviews with grassroots leaders, community leaders, opinion leaders, to gauge where this issue is on the policy landscape overall. If we had an opportunity, for example, to have a conversation with, who's an example of a person we might want to talk to here? Somebody who's
Walter
Mondale, or Larry Jacobs, or David Schultz, or these watchers of policy. If we had a chance to talk with them and get their view of where they think this issue is, sometimes that can really help us gauge how public support is advancing on an issue.
And just one more word about this. So, all of these things can be then measured and reported back to your funder, to your board of directors, whoever it may be. For example, let's say that you are able to do some bellwether interviews with some grassroots leaders. You then can gather that information, report back to your board of directors, for example, and say, we learned this, that our issue seems lower than this other issue but higher than this other issue, and that one of the messages that seems to have better traction is this message. So those are some of the things that you might be able to track and report back as part of your evaluation.
So shortly we're going to move to tools for evaluation. We're close to the end, but we have a question from Amy. And Amy asks, we have to scroll, could you scroll up there, Mark? What recommendations do you have when your evaluation shows that something isn't working? How to be a smart nonprofit and do things differently, even if your board or other leaders are tied to a strategy that might not be working? Actually, I'd say that there's some common things that can occur in nonprofit advocacy where we like to do an activity because we feel comfortable with it, because we've always done it, because other people expect that we'll do it, maybe our board or our stakeholders. One example of that might be a day on the Hill, a day at the Capitol. It can be very common that organizations do a day at the Capitol because we've always done a day at the Capitol. Using that as one of the things that we look at as we create a logic model will help us decide what is the leverage we're trying to create with our day at the Capitol, and what is the actual change that we're trying to influence through this particular activity. And then at the end of that, we can ask ourselves, did that work? Is it the change that we desired? If it is not, then having it laid out in a logic model or a theory of change where we can see this is the particular change that we desired, this is the activity that we tried, it did not work, so what other activities will help us get to that particular goal? I think laying it out like that where you can point to something with your board, with your stakeholders, with the other people that care about your work, to be able to say, we've tried this thing, we've done it over and over, it isn't working because we weren't able to push X lever in the policy process. Let's try something else. Having it all kind of laid out like that to see what our assumptions are is going to help us change course differently maybe than if we say, well, people feel really good about this, we've always enjoyed doing this. Well, maybe you're looking for a different outcome then. Sometimes with for example, a day at the Capitol, we might think that we're going in trying to actually influence a vote. We might schedule it on a day when there's a big vote, and we might think that that's going to be the way to influence the vote, and then the vote doesn't go our way. We might actually want to take a look at whether that has done anything to attract media attention to our issue, for example, and we could use that day as an example to get people to walk through the media room and change the framing on our issue. So sometimes we also need to look at our activities and decide, are we making the right assumption about the impact that we'll have? If it doesn't have that impact, is there a different impact that it's having that we still value? Do you have anything you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good example for my organization is at our day at the Capitol, we always had a rally in the rotunda. And it was, just automatic. You always, do that. And we decided a couple years ago that we weren't getting really any of our goals met by doing that. We already were doing a training of all our advocates in the morning and getting them all jazzed up to go meet with lawmakers. And what we found is that lawmakers actually found the rotunda rally to be more annoying than helpful. And we would get no media attention at all out of it. So we decided, let's, instead of devoting time and energy to that tactic, let's devote more time for the legislator meetings. And so we really just focus more now on making those legislator meetings with the grassroots folks very quality meetings. So I think that's a good example of looking back at, are you getting what you wanted? And if not, change course.
And actually asking your target, the legislators, if what you were doing is effective. Great.
Yep.
So we have 2 slides left related to tools. Rachel will talk about these as we wrap up our webinar today.
Yeah, so I included live links in the PowerPoint for you to go and check out some of these tools. And, it's really up to you which you think is going to be most useful. The first really I found is a very recent, up-to-date tool. It looked very good. It has a step-by-step guide for how to set up your advocacy evaluation, and it has links throughout each step for additional resources. So if you really want to focus in on one particular step, you can click on those resources. So I thought that was a really great tool. There's also a wonderful online tool called the Advocacy Progress Planner, and that uses that logic model that I kind of walked through that really gets you to input your information, and then multiple staff in your organization then can log in and make changes into that, and you can print out a report, and it's a really nice online tool. And then there's also a nice worksheet that really boils it down step by step, and so I included a link to that as well. And then I included 3 additional resources if you want to kind of roll up your sleeves a little more and really look at, additional tools or tactics that you might want to pursue. These would be some good additional resources. So that's all I got.
Great. So again, we are Susie Brown from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits and Rachel Callanan from the American Heart Association. We're really interested in this topic and in the success of our sector. In taking this on, we'd like to offer ourselves to you as resources. You can see our contact information there. Please feel free to be in touch with either of us if we can be of help as your organization thinks through how to best evaluate your advocacy efforts, because we'd like to be a part of your success, if that would be helpful. Thank you so much for joining the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits Advocacy webinar on evaluation, and we hope that you join us in December to talk about building relationships with elected officials. Thank you, and have a nice day.